The sun hung low over the coastal base, and the salty air carried the scent of the sea mixed with paint thinner as Elena Rivers moved her brush across the wooden doors of the old officers' quarters. Her motions were calm, steady, and practiced as, though the world behind those strokes did not exist, she worked quietly with her headphones tucked under her dark hair, painting one door after another, while the base around her throbbed with the distant rhythm of drills and engines she had been. Here for 3 weeks now, always arriving early, leaving late, never speaking more than a few words to anyone. The others saw her as just another civilian worker, a harmless woman with tired eyes and sleeves that reached her wrists even in the heat. But to Elena, the sleeves were not about modesty. They were armor against a world she had sworn to leave behind. That morning, a group of Navy SEALs returned from training, their laughter, rough and loud, echoing across the courtyard, boots splashing. Through puddles from the early storm, Elena did not look up as they passed. She had learned long ago that attention could be dangerous, but one voice cut through the noise, a low command tone that carried familiarity and authority. Chief Mason Cole led the team, and though he did not know her, his path was about to cross hers in a way neither of them could have predicted. He stopped briefly to grab water from a nearby crate, and as he turned, his eyes fell on the woman painting quietly near, the far corner. Something about her posture. Her control caught his attention, but he dismissed it at first until the brush slipped slightly from her grip and her sleeve rolled back. The sight made him freeze, a small emblem inked faintly into the inside of her wrist, a design so specific it could not be mistaken. The stylized wings over a dagger and the Latin words beneath them blurred but recognizable. Mason felt the blood drain from his face. It was the insignia of Operation Meridian A. Classified unit, long erased from record. He had seen that mark only once before on a memorial wall at Coronado, the same wall that listed every operative who never came home from that mission. Elena noticed his stare instantly and tugged her sleeve. Back down, pretending not to notice her heart skipping a beat behind the calm surface she had built over years of hiding. She knew that look. The look of recognition and fear. She kept painting slower now, as Mason struggled to compose himself. His team had moved ahead, calling for him, but his legs would not move. He felt trapped between memory and disbelief because the woman before him was supposed to be dead. He finally turned away, pretending to check his watch before jogging to catch up. With the others, his mind spinning, he told himself it was coincidence that maybe the tattoo was just a copy, some sort of misinterpretation. But deep down, he knew better. Only those who had bled for Meridian carried that symbol. It was never public. Never known outside their ranks. The operation had been sealed, erased because of what it uncovered, because of what it cost, and no one survived. At least that was what they were told. Elena set her brush down and exhaled slowly. She had made a mistake. She had gotten too comfortable. The sleeve had slipped. And now the past she buried under years of silence was clawing back to the surface. She could feel it like a vibration in the air. The quiet. Before something breaks, she packed her supplies faster than usual, not looking toward the barracks or the SEALs as she loaded her tools into the truck. The base suddenly felt smaller, the shadows longer, every sound sharper. She could feel eyes on her, even when no one was there. That night, Mason could not sleep, his mind replaying the image of the tattoo over and over. He went to the archives under the pretense of preparing a report for his next deployment, but his true purpose was buried under layers of clearance. He accessed the internal data logs, cross-referencing old operations until he hit the classified folder, Operation Meridian file, locked with triple encryption. His clearance denied even as a senior SEAL operator. He frowned, leaned back in the chair, and rubbed his face. Something inside him refused to let it go. He typed again, this time using a bypass he learned years ago, and within seconds a blurred image loaded on the screen. A group of operatives' faces half burned from the digital decay, and among them a woman with the same Cold eyes, same scar under the jawline. Same energy that Elena carried even under civilian paint clothes. He zoomed closer, his stomach tightening. It was her. He printed the image and stuffed it into his pocket, knowing it was a mistake to dig deeper. Yet unable to stop, he needed answers. He needed to know how someone declared dead could be painting doors on a base she should never have entered in the first place outside. Thunder rolled across the ocean horizon, echoing like distant artillery. Mason looked through the rain-streaked window and wondered if maybe he had already gone too far. If maybe seeing that tattoo had set something in motion that could no longer be stopped. Back in her small rented cabin near the docks Elena sat with. The lights off, watching the flicker of the storm through half-drawn curtains. She had felt the shift the moment he saw the mark. She could almost hear the gears of fate turning again. She poured herself a cup of cold coffee and stared at her reflection. In the glass, whispering words she had not spoken in years. You should have stayed hidden. You should have never come back. But she knew why she returned. The past was not done with her. Not yet. She reached for the worn photograph tucked inside her, jacket an image of her old unit. The same faces Mason had seen, only she knew the truth behind that photo, and the lie written beneath it all killed in action. Her dog tags lay on the table, dull with age. She traced the edges before shoving them into her bag as if hiding them could erase what they meant somewhere beyond the window. A car engine idled, then cut off footsteps on wet gravel, and Elena froze, every instinct sharpening her breath. Silent, her hand drifting toward the utility knife beside. The paint cans. Someone was outside moving slowly, stopping near the door. The handle twitched softly once, twice, then silence stretched until it felt like hours. She reached for her phone, but it was dead. No signal. The storm had cut the line again. She waited, eyes locked on the dark outline beneath the doorframe, her mind racing back to the deserts, to the nights of no sound before violence. When her unit disappeared one by one, her pulse rose. The handle turned again, then stopped. She held her breath, waiting for the knock that never came, and when the silence grew unbearable, she took a step forward, knife in hand, but before she could reach the door, a shadow moved past the window and vanished into the rain, leaving her standing there motionless, her heart pounding as the thunder swallowed every trace of the intruder. She knew then that it was beginning again, and this time there would be no place left to run. ChatGPT said. The morning came gray and heavy with fog curling between the hangars. As Mason Cole stood by the pier, staring out at the water, trying to convince himself that what he saw yesterday was a mistake. But the image of that tattoo burned too clear in his mind. He had seen it up close during debriefings when the unit was still whispered about among older operators. Operation Meridian was never spoken aloud for a reason. They had uncovered something within their own command, something dark enough to erase every trace of their existence. The official story said, ambush. No survivors, but Mason remembered the classified rumor that one operative had vanished before the final transmission. A woman who knew too much. He never believed it until now. He turned and saw her across the lot, loading paint cans into the back of her old truck. Her movements cautious, her eyes scanning every angle without looking paranoid, a habit learned by someone who had survived too long under threat. Mason wanted to approach her again, but something about the tension in her shoulders warned him off. She was aware she was being watched, maybe not by him alone. He noticed the dark SUV parked down the road, tinted windows unmoving. Too deliberate for a coincidence, he pretended to stretch, looking past her to catch the reflection on the glass, a figure inside with a camera or scope pointed in their direction. The SUV drove away when she shut the tailgate, and Mason's instincts screamed danger. He walked over casually, calling out, "Hey, excuse me, miss, you dropped this holding. Out." A rag from the ground, she paused, turning slowly, her eyes cautious, calculating, but she nodded, taking it without expression. "Thanks," she said, her voice low, firm, controlled. He studied her up close and saw the tiny scar just under her ear, a tactical MIC implant removal scar known only to deep field operatives before he could speak. She said, "You shouldn't ask questions you don't want answered." And then she stepped around him, climbing into her truck, leaving him standing there with the storm, wind whipping across the asphalt. That night, Mason couldn't let it go. He went back into the data vault this time using an old contact from Intel. He got access to a redacted briefing. Meridian compromised target, classified corruption, internal assets. Neutralized survivors, 0. He scrolled further until a note blinked in the bottom corner. Subject E designation lost in transit. Last confirmed alive sector, Delta 14 presumed dead. It was her Elena Rivers, or rather, Lieutenant Elena Monroe, former. Tactical communications specialist and field medic. He leaned back stunned. She was a ghost walking in plain sight on a Navy base. She should have been buried under a false name 10 years ago. Meanwhile, Elena drove toward the edge of town, heart racing. Every car behind her felt like a tale. She knew how these things worked once your name surfaced, even by accident. They sent watchers first, then cleaners. She gripped the wheel tighter, trying to keep her breathing steady. The rain returned, pounding the windshield until she could barely see. She took the side road through the trees toward her cabin. Every sense alert, she parked in silence, lights off, before stepping out to check the perimeter, the footprints she found. Near the back door were too fresh and not hers. She crouched, low fingers brushing the wet dirt. A single print with combat tread. Not civilian. She backed away slowly, eyes on the tree line. Inside, she locked the door, set down her bag, and pulled. The small metal box from under the floorboard inside lay her old service pistol. A faded set of photos and a data chip, the one she swore never to use. She had stolen it the night Meridian fell. It contained proof of what they had uncovered proof. The powerful men inside the command had sold information that led to her team's ambush. She stared at it, trembling between guilt and rage before slipping it into her pocket. She whispered to the empty room, "If they've found me, they'll come." For this next back at the base, Mason got a message from a restricted channel. "Meet me at the docks, midnight alone." He hesitated, but curiosity overruled caution. He arrived early, finding the pier empty until a small flashlight blinked twice from behind. A container. Elena stepped out wearing a hood and the same calm face she had earlier, but her eyes burned with warning. She said, "You're not safe now. They saw you looking. You've put yourself in this, whether you meant to or not." He asked. "Who are they?" she said. "People who erase what they can't control, people who ended Meridian before it spoke." Mason tried to reason with her, but she cut him off. "They're already here. I can feel it." A noise behind them made them both freeze. Footsteps soft. Against the wood, Elena pulled him down behind the crate. Signaling silence, 2 men in tactical rain gear walked by, scanning the area. One spoke into a radio. Negative, no visual. They must have moved inland. They waited until the men disappeared before. Elena exhaled and stood. She looked at Mason and said, "If you want to live, you'll forget you ever saw me." He grabbed her wrist gently, not to stop her but to make her look at him. "You don't get to disappear again." He said not after they tried to. "Bury the truth." She shook her head. "It's not about truth, it's about survival." She turned to leave, but the sound of an engine roared down the dock lights, cutting through the mist. A truck skidded to a stop. Black-clad figures jumped out, weapons drawn. Mason reacted instantly, pulling her behind a metal barrier as bullets ripped across the pier, splinters flying into the air. He shouted, "Move!" and they sprinted toward the end of the dock, diving behind an old fishing boat. She fired back too, quick shots. Precise. Controlled, dropping one of the attackers. Mason stared, stunned. Her reflexes flawless, too good for a civilian. She said later, "We run now. Not fight. Not yet." They slipped through the back alleys, drenched and breathless, until the base lights faded behind them. She led him through a narrow path into an abandoned boathouse hidden among reeds. Once inside, she finally spoke. "You shouldn't have followed me," He said you'd be dead if I hadn't." She gave a hollow smile. "Maybe. I already am." He looked at her, then realizing she meant it. Not as metaphor, but as truth, that somewhere on paper she didn't exist anymore. Outside, sirens echoed distant, but drawing closer. Mason glanced at her, asking what happens now. She looked out the broken window toward the sea and said, "We finish what they started, or we both disappear next time for real." He wanted to ask more, but her eyes said it all. She had carried the weight of 10 years of silence, and now that silence had been broken. She moved to the corner, pulling out a small waterproof case, setting it on the table, and opening it, revealing files, maps, coordinates. He saw the name of a man circled in red, Commander Holt, a high-ranking officer still active. She said he signed our death orders. He's still out there. Mason felt a chill run through him as he realized this was no longer about curiosity. It was about survival and truth, and the line between them blurred with every second the storm outside grew louder. Lightning flashing across the walls, illuminating their faces, one marked by loss, the other by disbelief. She said softly, "They'll come again before sunrise, and this time they won't miss." He looked at her and said, "Then we don't wait for them." And in the silence that followed, the storm crashed against the shore like a war drum, echoing the promise of violence that neither of them could escape. The storm carried through the night like an unending growl, shaking the walls of the boathouse, where Elena and Mason sat in the dim light of a single flickering lantern, neither speaking for long minutes. Each lost in their own thoughts. Mason's uniform was still damp, his pulse still racing from the ambush on the pier, while Elena's hands stayed steady as she checked the pistol, cleaned it, and placed it on the table beside the waterproof case. She looked composed, but Mason could see the strain behind her eyes. The same haunted calm he had seen in operators who had seen too much and lived to regret it. He finally broke the silence, asking her, "Why did they want you dead? What could you possibly know that was worth wiping an entire unit from existence?" She stared at him for a long moment, then opened the case, pulling out a folded photo and sliding it across the table. He looked down at the grainy image of a younger Elena in desert fatigues standing beside 5 others, their faces smeared with dust and exhaustion. Behind them, a convoy of armored trucks burned in the sand. She said Meridian was sent to extract a scientist held hostage by a foreign militia, but that was never the real objective. The orders were false. The militia was paid off by someone on the inside. Our extraction point was compromised because Command sold our coordinates to cover a deal gone bad. Mason felt the air leave his lungs as she continued. The scientist was working on a classified bioweapon program tied to contractors under U.S. supervision. If the truth came out, half the senior brass would have faced court-martial. Instead, they silenced us, they bombed our extraction zone, left us for dead, then declared the mission lost. She said it with no emotion, as though every word was carved from stone. Mason sat back, his jaw tight, the pieces aligning in his mind. He had heard whispers about Meridian years ago, but everyone who spoke of it either vanished or recanted. Suddenly, he understood why her presence on base had triggered such a fast response. She was a living threat to powerful people. She was proof of their betrayal. Elena stood, walked to the window, and stared at the flicker of lightning over the sea, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. She said, "I was the comms tech. I intercepted one message before the blackout it contained. Holt's signature authorization. He was the one who gave the strike order, and he's still sitting in command, pretending to be a hero." Mason clenched his fists, his respect for the chain of command crumbling piece by piece. If what she said was true, then the system he served had blood on its hands. They both turned as the sound of footsteps crunched outside the boathouse, slow, deliberate, measured. Mason grabbed his rifle, nodding to Elena, who doused the lantern, plunging them into darkness. Through the crack in the wall, he saw flashlights moving in the fog, 3, maybe 4 men sweeping the area. One of them spoke over a radio, confirming visual on the vehicle abandoned near the dock. Mason whispered under his breath, They tracked us. Elena tapped his shoulder, motioning to the rear door. They slipped out silently, moving through the reeds as the fog wrapped around them like smoke. The men entered the boathouse moments later. A voice barked out, "Check the back." They couldn't stay still anymore. They crept along the shoreline, the tide slapping at their boots, until they reached a narrow cliff path leading toward the old supply tunnels abandoned since the 70s. Elena remembered them from base schematics. They were used for coastal defense storage back when the Navy first occupied the area. She led the way down the slippery rocks. Mason, close behind the entrance, half buried in ivy and stone. They squeezed inside just as flashlights swept across the cliff above, them voices echoing in frustration. She motioned for silence, pressing a finger to her lips as the men moved on. Inside the tunnel, the air was damp cold, carrying the scent of rust and decay. They walked slowly, their steps echoing off the concrete. Walls, the tunnel stretched deep under the hill, networked like veins from forgotten war days. Elena's flashlight flickered, revealing faded markings on the walls, numbers, arrows, directions that led to collapsed storage rooms and blocked exits. They reached a wide chamber where old crates lay shattered and twisted metal beams jutted from the ceiling. She set the light on a crate and sat down, exhaling. Mason watched her carefully, asking, "What's next?" She said, "There's a man in D.C. who still owes me a favor. Someone from intelligence. He might still have access to the Meridian files. If we can reach him before they reach us, we might expose Holt." Mason asked, "And if we don't," she replied, "then we vanish again for good." They sat there for a while, listening to the storm fade into a low murmur outside. Mason finally said, "You could have stayed hidden. Why come back to a Navy base?" She looked up, eyes glinting in the weak light. "Because I was tired of hiding," she said, "tired of pretending. The people who murdered my team won. I thought maybe if I blended in long enough, I could get close enough to finish it, but I underestimated how quickly they'd notice." She paused, staring at her hands. "I didn't think anyone would recognize the tattoo." Mason gave a short, bitter laugh. "Neither did I." They packed up before dawn, moving through the tunnels until they emerged near the highway. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and electric. They found an abandoned gas station where Elena hot-wired an old truck, and Mason watched her work, amazed at her precision. When the engine roared to life, she looked at him and said, "You coming or staying?" He said, "I'm in. I've gone too far to turn back." She nodded and drove off toward the east, the road stretching endless and wet under the gray morning. Sky hours later, they stopped near an old diner off Route 41. Mason went inside to grab food while Elena stayed in the truck scanning the parking lot. Habit turned reflex. She noticed a motorcycle parked 2 rows down its rider, pretending to read. A newspaper too, still too focused, she muttered under her breath. "We're not alone." Mason returned with coffee, and she motioned subtly toward the rider. He followed her gaze, then cursed softly. She started the engine before the man could react. They peeled out of the lot tires, screeching. The motorcycle followed fast, headlights cutting through the rain-soaked road. Mason shouted left. She swerved into the back road leading toward the hills, the chase twisting through narrow turns until the rider drew closer. Gun raised, Elena slammed the brakes, spinning the truck sideways. Mason fired once through the windshield, hitting the front tire. The bike crashed, skidding into the ditch, the rider groaning as the vehicle toppled. Elena jumped out, weapon drawn, moving like she'd never stopped being a soldier. Mason covered her as she pulled the man's mask off, revealing the face of someone she recognized, her old commanding sergeant. She whispered his name, barely believing it. He coughed blood and said, "They sent me to find you before Holt does." Then his eyes rolled back, gone. Mason looked at her in shock. She knelt there, rain pouring down, face hard and distant. She said, "Then it's already started. If Holt sent his own people after me, it means he's cleaning up everything and everyone who knows the truth." She stood holstering the weapon and staring into the distance where thunder rolled again. Mason asked, What do we do now? She said we hit him first. As the truck disappeared into the fog, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, and far behind them on the road, another vehicle pulled out of the trees following their tracks. Silent, steady, relentless. The hunt had only just begun. The night wind tore through the harbor, carrying the echo of gunfire. As Elena and Mason moved through the maze of shipping containers, every shadow holding danger, every step driven by instinct. The alarms still screamed in the distance, flashes of red slicing through the mist they had. Holt's files, but the enemy was closing in faster than they could escape. Elena gripped the drive like it was her heartbeat. Mason followed behind rifle, ready, his breath steady. Though his mind raced through every possible exit route, he knew this. Kind of chase, no backup, no second chances. They reached the end of the dock and found their path blocked by two black SUVs, headlights glaring through the fog, soldiers stepping out, weapons drawn. Mason pulled Elena behind a stack of metal drums, whispering, "We can't stay here." She nodded, eyes scanning the water below. There was a fishing boat tied to a lower platform just far enough to reach if they jumped. She said there, pointing. He shook his head too far, too open. "They'll shoot us before we get." Halfway, she looked at him, the same fire in her eyes that once led her team through hell. "Then we don't give them a choice," she whispered. Without hesitation, she threw a smoke grenade into the open space, thick white clouds exploding across the dock. The attackers opened fire blindly, bullets cutting through metal and sparks flying. Mason grabbed her hand. They ran through the smoke, diving over the edge into the cold black water below. The shock hit like a blade, stealing their breath. They surfaced. Gasping as bullets tore into the waves around them, Elena kicked hard, dragging them toward the lower platform. Mason covered her with suppressive shots from his sidearm, every echo swallowed by thunder. They reached the boat, climbing aboard, dripping. And shivering, she started the engine while he kept watch. The engine roared to life just as another vehicle skidded to the edge of the dock. Holt stood there, illuminated by the burning light behind him. His face, hard eyes locked on them. He raised his weapon, but Mason fired first, one clean shot striking the metal rail beside him. Holt stumbled back into the chaos, shouting orders, as the boat sped away into the fog. The harbor, shrinking behind them, drowned in flame and smoke. Elena kept her, eyes forward, the horizon opening endless ahead. She said quietly, "It's over." Mason looked at her, not sure if she believed it. She stared at the small drive in her hand and whispered, "Not yet." As dawn broke, the sky turned silver, the light touching, the waves like fire. Mason watched her profile, calm but distant. The tattoo on her wrist glowing faintly under the pale sun, the symbol of Meridian reborn, not as a mark of death, but of survival. She said softly, "They thought ghosts fade, but they don't. They wait." Mason nodded, gripping the wheel tighter, knowing that somewhere behind them, the truth they unleashed was already spreading, unstoppable like the tide. The base was silent when they returned, only the low hum of machines and the sound of their boots echoing down the empty corridor. Mason walked beside Elena, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip, though he knew it would not protect them from what was coming. The commander was waiting in the debrief room, his face pale, his eyes scanning the mud and blood on their uniforms before falling to the small drive in Elena's hand. She placed it on the table without a word, the air between them heavy as if it could shatter from a single breath. He looked at the drive, then at her, wrist, his expression shifting when he saw the tattoo. His jaw tightened, the same symbol hidden deep within classified files years ago. A mark erased from every record. Mason saw it too, and realized the truth hit the commander like a storm. Meridian had never ended, it had only gone underground. Elena's silence was an answer in itself. She had been part of something long buried, a project the world was never meant to know, and now it had surfaced again. The commander turned off the lights, only glow coming from the monitor. As he opened the files, the screen filled with Face's mission logs and one photo that made him freeze a group of operatives standing by a desert wreckage. One of them was Elena, much younger, her eyes the same calm, defiance even then. Mason watched him struggling between duty and fear. Then he said quietly, "You should not have come back." Before she could speak, the alarm blared again, red lights flashing through the room. The commander looked up, confusion on his face. Mason reached for his weapon as the ground trembled. A blast echoed through the outer walls, the sound of chaos rising once more. Elena turned toward the window flames in the distance, shadows moving fast. She whispered, "It's them. They're here to erase everything." Mason grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the exit. But she stopped just for a moment, looking back at the commander who still stared at the screen, frozen between truth and survival. She said softly, "Tell them Meridian was never the threat the silence was," and then she ran through the corridor with Mason beside her, the smoke closing in the sound of the base crumbling behind them. Their figures swallowed by the dawn that broke over the horizon, leaving only the echo of her words drifting through the burning air as the truth finally began to wake.